All right, and so we're ready to go, and I'm going to jump right in. And you'll remember, of course, that we're in the middle of a series of lectures on the 2022 elections, and in particular on the issues that are the most pressing issues facing the country and that we would hope might be debated in the course of a national election. And I've been speaking with you for the last week about economic issues. Last week, I in particular concentrated on inflation and not just the domestic, but in particular, the global threat that American inflation fighting policy potentially poses. And to be as clear as possible, with inflation, it is something that is highly destructive for average consumers' purchasing power. It erodes the value of wages. It makes it difficult for people to plan. It eats up savings by making them worth less. There's a lot that's destructive about inflation. But unfortunately, the medicine that we have to fight inflation seems to be almost as bitter as inflation itself. And I emphasized in particular that the global economy of 2022, in which a lot of companies and a lot of corporations have very high levels of debt, and in which, therefore, increased interest rates pose risks for debt default, whether that's sovereign or corporate or individual debt default. It can occur in multiple forms. And that because the US dollar is the de facto global currency, when we raise interest rates, we expose economic vulnerabilities, not just in the United States. I'm going to focus more on the domestic today, but also globally. And I just want to connect that issue and the deeper issue I'm going to be talking about today, which is domestic economic inequality, to the bigger issue that I use to frame the overall perspective I'm taking in these lectures, which is the alternation in American politics between ordinary or normal politics, in which we focus on pocketbook issues, in which we are basically partisan, in which we don't spend a lot of time in our politics, and then the occasional shift into a different mode, a more constitutional mode of politics, in which we are concerned not just with how current policies are doing for us, but much more with the character of the charter of our society. Are we happy with the way our institutions are organized and the kinds of commitments to justice and each other they seem to express? And that when we fall into that second mode of politics, we tend to be more reflective, more deliberative, more focused on the good of the country and less on the individual's particular good. And that there seem to be some signs in 2022 that constitutional politics is being revived, not as the dominant mode yet, but perhaps in certain quarters, and that it is beginning to change the dynamics of our politics. There have been some recent polls that suggest that may not be occurring as much, perhaps, as I had suggested. And I'm certainly open to the idea that politics changes. They say a week is an eternity in politics. And obviously, several weeks have gone by since I suggested that frame. But I also want to, in a sense, argue that the way that we talk about economic issues actually is open to two different construals. And I want to point to FDR in particular and the New Deal. And if you remember, the New Deal is one of the three moments in American politics that Bruce Ackerman, whose framework I'm drawing on, suggests as a moment of constitutional politics. And of course, FDR suggested, right, the very idea of a New Deal, a fundamental change in American economic policy to have a federal government that was more active in regulating the national economy, and especially to protect ordinary Americans from various forms of vulnerability. And the people at the bottom of the distribution of income and wealth tend to be most vulnerable and so most in need of that protection. And his idea expressed, I think, clearest in his Four Freedoms speech, that this is a right of citizenship of Americans not to have to worry, to be beset by fear. And that in that sense, FDR moved economic issues into a constitutional discourse. And it seems to me one of the big questions in this decade is whether we will make a similar transition. And so one of the things I have to say, I'm quite disappointed in the Democratic Party about is that they seem to be unwilling to do what FDR did, to suggest that it's not just about how quickly the economy is growing or how bad inflation is, but that the underlying social bargain in which individuals work and contribute to the society, and the society owes them certain rights and entitlements as a result, that may not be working in the 21st century in the way that it worked in the middle of the 20th century, and that this is not just an issue of economic policy. This is, in a sense, an issue of basic security, of citizens' rights. And so we need to address this issue as a constitutional issue in the 21st century. And the fact that we did so well with our COVID relief legislation, right? And let's not forget, and I'll talk in some detail about this, that we dramatically reduced childhood poverty in the year 2021, just last year, right? And it's a scandal, a moral scandal of our society, that a substantial portion, almost 50% of our children, experience food insecurity on a regular basis, that a substantial fraction of American children live in poverty, and that we know the psychological damage that this does to them, not to mention just the discomfort and anxiety of living with hunger and economic insecurity. And we know that it's not the children's fault, whatever we think of the parents. We implemented successful policies, and the Democrats are not talking about those policies. They're so concerned about inflation, that they're so concerned about roiling the markets. They're looking at what happened to Liz Truss in England this week, and the way in which her policies seem to have upset the markets. And when that happens, watch out. And so I think there's a lack of courage. I do think that one has to be strategic and careful, and clearly Liz Truss wasn't in the way in which you frame it. But I want to begin talking about economic policy issues and the broader context in which we think about those issues in the 21st century, in a way that continues this idea that maybe we need to revive constitutional politics and not just view economic policy as a kind of pocketbook issue. So That's the big idea behind this week. And I'll just mention very quickly where we stand in terms of having spoken last week about the short term problem of inflation and interest rate hikes, and the way in which, in a sense, we have a double edged sword here. Inflation is destructive, but so are the policy tools that we use to combat it. And that in a global economy, in a much less regulated economy in the 21st century, there may be hidden sources of fragility, unregulated and therefore undetected sources of risk, and that raising our interest rates is kind of like performing a stress test. We may unfortunately discover where those risks are buried as we navigate combating inflation, and that we should be thinking more about that. I'm going to return a little bit to the domestic problem, of um, uh, inflation fighting policy, in order to set up then a more long-term discussion. If inflation is the problem of 2022, the way in which that problem is being experienced relates to the fact that we have been in a neoliberal economic policy climate for 40 years now. And we need to talk about what that policy has done to our economy, to work, to inequality, to economic insecurity, and also to democracy, in order to understand why fighting inflation may be so painful in 2022, 2023. And in order to then move from understanding how we got to where we are, move instead into what we can do about it, the policy question. I want to start by examining the last time we successfully tamed capitalism by embedding the market in democracy and society. And so one of the big questions here, right, Liz Truss is a perfect example. And the former prime minister, the shortest lived prime minister in British history, didn't pursue policies that I have any sympathy for. I mean, and there are two ways to view what happened to her. One way is to say, in a period of high inflation, her policies threatened to exacerbate inflation, and the markets punished her. I think there's real insight in that. But I think another way to tell the story of Truss is that she doubled down on neoliberal policy at a moment when we are all reckoning with the limits of neoliberal policy. And therefore, she seemed to be placing her bet on an increasingly discredited approach to economic philosophy. And that also, I think, accounts for some of the lack of political staying power that she had. So with that in mind, that's a failed effort to change the economy through policy. When is the last time we had major success with regards to this? And in particular, success in addressing the problems that plague us now: inequality, vulnerability, lack of political accountability by the most powerful economic actors. And I want to point to the New Deal and the middle of the 20th century as a way of setting the table for them thinking about how we might succeed in implementing policy in the 21st century. And so that's the somewhat large agenda for today. Let's see how far we can get. I just want to refresh your memory very quickly. We're in a period of high inflation. We are therefore increasing interest rates at the same time we are decreasing government expenditures. And this is because inflation costs everyone money. It undermines everybody's earnings. It leads to a lack of predictability and a lack of confidence in the economy. And in particular, it is worse for the people at the bottom of the income distribution, who are already living paycheck to paycheck, and all of a sudden everything costs more. If you've been to the grocery store or the gas pump, you know that things cost more. This recent rapid increase in inflation occurs in a context in which wages have been stagnant or decreasing, household income barely treading water for over 20 years, and where many families, if they have been able to maintain their standard of living, have only been able to do so because inflation has been contained for a large class of goods, even though it has been going up for those goods that cannot be globalized or outsourced. I pointed out to you that it's tricky to understand where inflation is coming from right now, and I don't think any of us should be too confident that we understand it fully, because it's enormously complex and we are right in the onset of a new inflationary episode. We don't really know, but what we do seem to suspect is that a fair bit of it is caused by the pandemic, and this diagram gives you the complex interconnection between issues to do with supply chains, labor shortages, therefore component shortages, and the bottlenecks that have interfered with manufacturing of durable goods as a result at precisely the moment that demand for durable goods went up because people were not purchasing services, traveling, going out for dinner, movies, etc. during the pandemic. That we also have Putin's invasion of the Ukraine and what that's done to our energy markets. So it's been highly disruptive, and OPEC appears poised to make this worse as opposed to better. And then we had large government expenditures to try to counteract the COVID recession of the last couple of years. You put all of these factors together, and you have multiple sources of inflationary pressure. Having said that, it's still far from clear exactly what kind of inflation we have. I think it's probably not transitory. It's lasted long enough, and it seems to be amplifying itself a little bit. That the idea that it's just going to go away of its own accord doesn't perhaps seem credible anymore. But it could still be sector specific as opposed to general and structural. That is to say, it could be caused by those few things I just mentioned, the pandemic and supply line bottlenecks, supply chain bottlenecks, the increase in energy prices, primarily caused by the war in the Ukraine, and government policy. And please note that 2 out of those 3 factors we are already addressing, right? The COVID government stimulus spending has gone away. The bottlenecks in the supply chain are starting to be solved, unraveled. And obviously, what's happening with energy prices is a stickier wicket. It seems to still be an issue and may get worse. But the question is whether we've actually entered the period in which, as opposed to having to solve those 3 problems, we have self-feeding inflation, where we have a so-called wage price spiral because the price of everything is going up. Workers demand more money because workers demand higher wages. Employers, corporations, firms have to pass those costs along, and then workers need to demand still further wages, right? Generalized self-feeding cyclical inflation of the kind we had in the 1970s. And I think one way to describe current economic policy thinking in the part of central bankers is they probably hope and believe that this is sector specific, but they're frightened that this is general or structural inflation beginning to take hold. Because once self-feeding inflation takes hold, it's so hard to combat, right? It took, a really extreme interest rate hike in the early 1980s to break the back of the inflation that really lasted throughout the entire 1970s and into the 1980s. And we would prefer not to have inflation last that long and have to take those extreme measures. Better somewhat harsh measures now than extremely harsh measures later. But there are risks associated even with somewhat harsh measures. And I shared this crazy diagram with you. Sorry, my mouse seems to have a mind of its own today. This crazy diagram with you that is indicating that in a globally interconnected world in which there are multiple potential sources of crisis, and in which those crises themselves or those crisis potentials are interconnected, such that a crisis in one area could trigger a crisis in another area, or those two crises could exacerbate each other and cause a third. We have to be worried about the way in which our domestic policy has ramifications in various other locations and theaters. And to give you a sense of the vulnerability here, we can start out by noting that the world has a very high overall level of total sovereign debt, and the ratings have gone down and down, 140% of GDP. And what this means is that as interest rates go up, we may see either governmental or corporate debt crises starting to become more common, and interest rates are going up, and they're being driven by the Federal Reserve because the dollar is the de facto global currency. When the US raises its interest rate, that tends to reverberate throughout the world. You can see, right, that the US share of world trade is not tiny, right? We punch way above our weight. We have a small fraction of the world's population, but 10% of the world's trade. But then when you look up to the amount of international transactions that are demarcated in dollars, what you see is the hegemony of the dollar, right? 90+% of the world's financial transactions are demarcated in dollars. And to get a sense then of the potential risks of increasing the strength of the dollar vis-a-vis other currencies, and then increasing the difficulty of debt repayment as a result, in addition to increased interest rates, making it more difficult to pay back those debts. This is the interest rate shock that Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve, brought about in the early 1980s to finally tame the stagflation of the 70s. And as you can see, real interest rates climbed dramatically in a short period of time. It worked to bring inflation under control in the United States, but this is what it did to South America, North America, and Africa, right? And I don't know if you can make out the diagram there, but those black areas saw their debt exceed 100% of their national income. You may remember the Argentine debt and currency crisis, but one way to express this, and obviously it hit Africa hard as well, is that the US triggered debt crisis in South America from 1982 to 1985 was more destructive for South America than the Great Depression was. It caused waves of hunger, of insolvency, of bankruptcy, of homelessness in some of the poorest places in the world. And that is in an era in which the world economy is less interconnected than it is today. We have to be concerned, not only morally, obviously we should be concerned. We should be cosmopolitan enough that we don't want our policy to cause misery in the poorest places in the world, but we should also be pragmatically concerned about this. The world economy is interconnected. If we cause a collapse, sovereign debt crisis, if the result is a liquidity crisis in some of the banks that loan internationally, that's coming home to the United States in the form of our own economic crises very quickly. So now let's return home. And that's where we left off last week. And I just want to point out to you, debt is high in the United States as well, right? It's not as high as it was in 2008 in terms of overall household debt, but total household debt is very high. There are two different scales here. On one scale, actually, it is higher than it was, and that's just in constant dollars in 2008. And there's a reason we are unable to live without consumer debt or household debt as a society. And this diagram, I think, shows very well what that reason is. It divides into two periods from 1959 to 1994. That's a long period in which Americans, between income savings and access to debt, were able to maintain their standard of living based on the resources available to them. Beginning in 1994, and remember, wages are stagnant and household income begins to decline in 1995. So there's a reason for the inflection point being located in the mid 1990s. Income savings and debt no longer fund the basic living standard of Americans. And the result is, right, that there is a larger and larger gap between what it costs to maintain your standard of living and what the resources are available to you. And the result is that on the one hand, the savings rate goes down, and on the other hand, debt goes up, right? And this is, of course, distributed unevenly. This diagram shows you the difference between the median debt level of the bottom 80% of society and the top 20%. And as you can see, the top 20%, their debt is about 50% of their income. And that is a manageable debt to service. Whereas for the bottom 80%, the rest of us, our debt is between 250 and 300% of our annual income. And that is impossible to manage in a high interest rate environment, right? And so right now, before the interest rate spike, the people in the bottom 80% are spending 15 to 20% of their income just on servicing their debt. It's their credit card payments, it's their mortgage payments, etc. Student loans are actually a very big factor here. The people in the top 20% spending more like 5% of their income. The people in the top 5% spending more like 2%. And so this is going to be sustainable for the people at the top. It's not going to be sustainable for the people at the bottom. And let me just say for a moment here, right? When we look back at the 2008 economic crisis and we look at the kinds of policies that were put in place, those policies tended to protect the large economic actors, right? They bailed out the banks, they saved some of the brokerage firms, they saved the American automobile industry. And I'm not saying that those are things we shouldn't do, but what I would add immediately is that much less was done to benefit or protect the people in the bottom 80% of our society. Big investors did benefit from those bailouts, and the economy as a whole was rescued by those bailouts. And that's extremely important. But a large number of Americans, millions, lost their homes, saw their wealth radically contract, lost jobs, and did not get adequate benefits. And I think that reflects both the priorities and the perspective of too many economic policymakers. They come from the top 20 or the top 10 or the top 5%, and they tend to be in conversation with other bankers and other big institutional actors. They're not paying sufficient attention to the people at the bottom. So the people at the bottom, they believe the system is corrupt, the system is rigged. They end up feeling that the elite pay no attention to their situation, and then they're angry, right? And as opposed to trusting elites, they start to basically think these are people who only pay attention to people like them and not like me, as opposed to pursuing policies that might better their situation or being convinced that there are policies that might better their situation. They end up so filled with grievance and anger that they just want to throw a bomb at Washington, D.C., release the Tasmanian devil on Congress. And in 2016, the Tasmanian devil had a big tuft of orange hair, right? And so the idea that a politics that seeks to vent anger and grievance on our institutions as opposed to using them to address our problems is rooted in failed economic policy is again something that we should be paying a lot of attention to in 2022 as we look at what the bitter medicine of raising interest rates and contracting government expenditures is going to do to the bottom 80%. It's going to interfere with their fiscal, financial viability. People are going to be hungry, not be able to feed their children, not be able to maintain their current housing, may end up homeless, not be able to pay for their medical bills, or else they're going to be defaulting on their debt, whether it's their credit cards or their mortgage or their student loans, and they're going to end up with wrecked credit. And that's going to make life much more difficult for them because most Americans can't sustain their standard of living without access to credit. So let us not repeat the mistakes of 2008 in 2022, but to learn how not to do that, we need a deeper perspective. We need to ask why it is that we're in this situation. How did we get to a situation where there's such a sharp divide between those at the top and the rest of us, and where economic policy seems to pay exclusive attention to those at the top? And so I'm going to turn to somebody some of you have heard me speak about before that I think helps us to understand the economic history of the last 40 years. And obviously he's not alone. There's lots of people I could turn to, but I do think that Wolfgang Streeck, who is the former director of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, formerly a professor of economic sociology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and a prolific and important writer on the big picture of what's happening in the economy, helps us perhaps more than any other person to unpack this. And I'll focus primarily on this book, Buying Time, The Delayed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and this concept of democratic capitalism. So Streeck introduces us to neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a phrase that was coined in the 1930s to talk about an approach to economic philosophy and policy that basically says the government should regulate and tax as little as possible. And it gained steam through the work of thinkers like von Hayek, and then the Chicago School, Milton Friedman, and eventually, in part because of the failure of Keynesian policy to address the economic problems of stagflation in the 1970s, this economic policy gained adherence in the 1970s and came to be the reigning economic philosophy of most policymakers beginning in the 1980s, typically associated with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, though also in different ways adopted by left moderate leaders like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, continued primarily by Barack Obama. This came to be referred to as the Washington Consensus as it was exported to the rest of the world. And institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank made policies that were in conformity with neoliberal ideas a precondition of receiving international support. So many developing economies were also forced to adopt neoliberal policies in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. What are the key features of these policies? And I've referred to a couple of them already. The government should regulate as little as possible. And there's been a massive growth in the financialization of capitalism in the last 30 years. All kinds of new instruments like derivatives and new ways of hedging, and hence hedge funds becoming one of the largest concentrations of investment in the contemporary economy. And many of those sectors of the economy are either unregulated or very loosely regulated. We have not evolved our regulatory framework to keep up with the innovation in the financial sector. And so large portions of the financial sector are loosely or not regulated at all. And this is in keeping with this economic philosophy. Also, reducing taxes in order to allow economic innovation to reap rewards and therefore to incentivize it. And I'm sure that the tax burden on the wealthiest individuals, on corporations, has been reduced dramatically over the last 40 years. Again, this follows from this philosophy. A second aspect of this economic period is that there's been a major transition in the economies of the developed world away from industrial production, much of which has been outsourced or has migrated to economies where labor is cheaper than it is in the developed economies. And the developed economies, with the loss of manufacturing as its central economic activity, have moved over to financialization or financial services, other kinds of services, entertainment, education, information processing, a knowledge-based economy. And the result of this economic transition is greater inequality, because under the manufacturing economy, basically anybody who could do hard work could make a decent living. So that's the way industrialism rewarded people who might not have got much in terms of education or what's sometimes called human capital, but who were union members and showed up to work on a regular basis and had, as a result, economic mobility, economic security, decent jobs, decent benefits. This is especially true of the white working class in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. As we transitioned away from an industrial and into financialized service sector economy, a higher premium was attached to education and to the kind of specialized education that you get in liberal arts colleges and universities and with various specialized professional degrees. And so this has opened up a chasm of economic inequality in our society, where the bottom half, who's less well educated, is finding its wages eroded. Unionized jobs have become much rarer. The rate of unionization, union saturation or union density, I guess is the right word, in the United States is less of a third what it was 30, 40 years ago, right? And so substantial loss of union jobs and the security and benefits and collective solidarity that come with those kinds of jobs. And so more and more people feeling precarious, while at the top, the top 20, the top 10% incomes have skyrocketed. This has been a recipe for creating a lot of wealth, but a recipe for distributing that wealth very unevenly, inaugurating what has been referred to by many as a new gilded age. Um, we've also seen a rise in this same period of unfettered consumer culture, right? In which people want to engage in continuous compensatory consumption. We're not happy with the way the economy has changed, with the way in which our work has changed, with our growing economic insecurity, with our sense of our eroded status in society, if we are in the bottom 50% of the income distribution. But thanks to globalization, we might be able to get a new large screen plasma TV to watch our basketball and football and various other forms of entertainment on. We might be able to get our kids new phones every couple of years with all the new social media platforms running on them 24/7. Wolfgang Streeck refers to this as hoping, coping, doping, and shopping, right? That we are, in a sense, trying to compensate for an economy that we view as increasingly unfair and inhumane by taking what we can get in the role of consumers. And that's a fourth and final feature of these policies that we refer to broadly as neoliberal. Now, this is very familiar. I'm not going to belabor this. I've already shown you that, right, wages and household income have been stagnant throughout this period, right? That the top 0.01% have seen fabulous gains in wealth, their income having gone up by over 400% cumulatively. The top 1% doing reasonably well, also their income going up over 150%. The top 90% keeping pace with GDP growth, not quite 100% growth in income over that 40-year period. But then when we get down to the middle class, the middle 40%, barely 50% income gain, and the bottom 50% barely moving at all from where they were. The result is that basically almost 50% of the American population lives on less than $30,000 a year. 50% of the American population has less than $400 in savings, right? And this then is, I think, different ways of looking at the unfairness and the wide perception that the current economy is really skewed in its distribution of wealth and income in ways that don't make sense relative to the contribution, the hard work, the idea that we're all in this together, that we're all cooperating for the goal of making our society work. If we think about the consequences now, and these are not just economic, but more broadly social and political consequences of this era, I'm going to suggest five, but I'm going to highlight one in particular: disintegration of society. We used to, right, middle of the 20th century, refer to our primary political identity simply as being American, right? That it was a common unifying identity. Now, if you ask somebody their primary political identity, they're going to say Democrat or Republican, much more fragmentary, polarizing. And similarly, people are more likely to define themselves regionally, racially, sexually, or in terms of their gender. And also class-based solidarities, which were very much anchored by unions, have broken down. And so we've become a more fragmentary society overall. I don't think this is purely driven by culture, by the politics of identity. It is driven by changes to our economy. Second big consequence, sometimes referred to as risk shifts, sometimes referred to as responsibilization. Very quickly, part of the reason that Liz Truss saw her government collapse so quickly is that there was a problem with a big sector in the British economy, pension funds. And these are pensions that gave what are called defined benefits to their beneficiaries. And what that means, it's like teachers sometimes in the United States still today, but very few others, that you're guaranteed, let's say, for sake of example, 70% of your highest income level throughout your retirement, from the day you retire till the day you die, right? And so in that example, the school district, and in older examples, the company, the firm, the corporation took responsibility for planning to make sure that it could meet its responsibility to you. In America in the 21st century, almost no one gets a defined benefit pension. Instead, like me, you get a 401k, right? And it's up to you. How much are you going to invest in your 401k? And then it's up to you and the stock market. How much is that going to be worth at the time you retire? And is that going to be enough to get you to economic security for however long you need that income for, right? And the idea, the basic idea here is, well, thank you very much for working for us. We're going to give you a salary. It's up to you to plan for your retirement. Don't ask us. And so the risk, the burden, the need to take care of yourself has been shifted from government and corporate actors onto individuals. And the result is many of us are not very good at doing this, not very good at planning for all the risks we face. And by the way, when a lot of us are earning $30,000 a year or less, good luck saving enough for your retirement, right? And so risk shift has increased the vulnerability, the precariousness of many people in the United States. Third consequence of the neoliberal economic era, here now a more political consequence, it's undermined the sense that democracy is effective in steering society away from those outcomes members of the majority of the voting public find least acceptable. We don't want to retire into poverty, right? But the government seems incapable of putting in place policies that prevent this. Yes, we have Social Security, thank goodness. And right, it is in a sense almost like a defined benefit pension. Is it adequate? And by the way, do we want other things in terms of economic security? I think the answer is clearly yes. Has the government succeeded in any way in promoting those policies? The answer is almost certainly no. And so the sense that what we want, the government can't deliver, has been very important, a defining political feature of the neoliberal era. Fourth, and this is the point I've highlighted because I want to emphasize it, and this is really as much economic as it is social, and Wolfgang Streeck really emphasizes this. Crises, right? Deep recessions, liquidity crises, debt crises are not strikes of lightning that come out of the blue and are impossible to predict. They are the structural consequence of the way we have organized our economy. We should expect them on a fairly regular basis. And not only that, it's predictable that their magnitudes and scopes will continue to increase to the point where they're more and more difficult to manage. And that's in part because we've deprived our governments of the regulatory resources as well as of the tax income required to manage economic crises. But more importantly, it's because we've set down an unsustainable economic path. I'll get to a little bit more detail on this, but the effect of neoliberal economic policy has been to deprive a substantial majority of the population of the resources required to sustain their standard of living. And as citizens of developed democracies, most of us are unwilling to simply see our standard of living eroded consistently and reduced dramatically. And so we're fighting like hell to maintain it, primarily through debt, also sometimes through government services. And it's this high level of debt that generates these crises. And that should, right, sound an alarm bell as we're increasing interest rates to fight inflation. We should expect, right, crises will be more likely and more difficult to manage in a high inflation, high interest rate environment than they have been for the last 20 plus years. Fifth and finally, political backlash against all of this is channeled into democratic elections, right? Where do we have to give vent to the fact that we are unhappy with the current economic and political constellation? Well, if we do it at work, we could be out of a job pretty quickly, right? So we tend to shut up and put up at work. We can do it through elections, right? And in particular, again, I think that the best way to view the election of Donald Trump in 2016, yes, of course, there's a white nationalist element to it. There's an element of racial resentment, but there was also, I think, very much an effort to throw a grenade into Congress, to unleash a Tasmanian devil into the federal government. And that's what Trump promised to do, what Trump, in fact, did do. And that seems to be happening throughout the democratic world, right? Populist leaders expressing populist grievance are politically viable in the 2020s because, in part, what neoliberal economic policy has done to the countries of the developed world. You've probably seen this before. Streeck introduces this diagram to kind of summarize overall the results of his theory. I shouldn't say Streeck introduces this diagram. This is my diagram, but I think this is a good summary of Streeck's central conclusion. His central conclusion is that the modern state is simultaneously dependent on two distinct social systems that operate according to distinct and contradictory logics. On the one hand, states are dependent on voters, right, on the public sphere to get their legitimacy, right? And so if we don't like what the government is doing, we have the option in the next election to say, get out. We don't like you anymore. And by the way, with the next government, we want them to do what we want, what we need, what our interests are. And so this idea that the state is accountable to the public sphere, to what the average voter depends, and that if they don't do what the average voter demands, then it will lose its legitimacy and face a crisis. On the other hand, what the average voter tends to demand is that the state provides certain goods and services, that the state provide retirement security, public health services, housing, infrastructure, regulation, etc. Right? And all of those services are expensive. Where does the state get the money to provide the services that voters demand? It gets it from taxing, right? And that's the dominant source of revenue for the modern state. Where does tax income come from? It comes from market activity, right? And so the state is equally structurally dependent on markets, not only on public spheres. And that means it also has to please the markets, because especially in a global economy, if market actors are not satisfied with the policies, especially the tax and regulatory policies, the economic climate for manufacturing profit in a particular society, global corporations, the very wealthy investors can move their resources to another market. And so the problem here, of course, is what market actors want is quite different from what public actors want. Voters want higher taxes on the wealthy in order to fund the services they want the state to provide, right? And on the other hand, the market actors want low taxes so as to be able to increase their profits. I'm saying market actors, investors, capitalists, right? And Street's central claim is that the neoliberal economic policies have undone what was a mid-century compromise between these two conflicting sets of demands, which allowed adequate profitability for market actors, but at a relatively low level to fund services for voters and citizens that met their essential demands for economic security. Neoliberal policy shifted power and leverage away from the public sphere and into the markets. And the result is that the markets have gained the upper hand. Democracy has been weakened. The state is less capable of responding to the demands and interests of citizens, more beholden to what capitalist investors, market actors want them to do. Now, having said that, states cannot simply disregard what voters want them to do. And so one of Street's central conclusions is that debt has become endemic to modern economic and political circumstances. And so this diagram, which I know is a little complicated, has multiple lines on it. It has US government debt, US household debt, and inflation. And note, one of the things inflation does is it lets you pay off your debt in dollars that are worth less than when you actually took on that debt. So inflation, in a sense, is a debt reducing strategy. And what Street wants us to see from this diagram is that you can't get all three of these variables to come down at the same time. You can't get government debt, household debt, and inflation down all at the same time. If you drive government and household debt down, inflation goes up, right? If you drive inflation down, either government debt or household debt goes up, right? And he suggests that this is structural, rooted in a couple different fundamental factors about our economic moment. One of them is, right, that government expenditures constantly exceed tax revenue, right? That's a structural fact of the neoliberal era. That means governments need to run constant debt in order to be able to afford their operations while keeping their markets happy. A second thing that's happening here is that income is going down, right? This is the rate of growth of income from the 1940s, when it was growing at 4% a year, to the last decade when it was growing at 2% a year. This is the average share of the amount of overall productivity that goes to people who work for a living. This is called the labor share, right? People get this through wages. In the 1950s, it was about 2/3 of economic productivity was paid out in wages. In the present era, it's about 57%, right? That's a substantial contraction, a substantial redistribution away from laborers and in the direction of capital or investors. And then the consequence of all of this is that income is not keeping up with cost of living, so debt is higher. Both individual debt and corporate debt are higher in the neoliberal era than they were in the pre-neoliberal, the Keynesian era. And what this means is that we're going to have periodic crises, because at when interest rates go up, when credit becomes less readily available, you're going to have runs on resources. You're going to have banks begin to fail. You're going to have less liquidity, less available money, especially in the form of credit, for a modern economy to operate. And so it is this that is driving, on the one hand, inequality, and on the other hand, periodic crises, according to Streeck. This is not then, right, a post-COVID problem. This is not a problem of the 2020s. This is a problem that is 40 years in the making, that has to do with the weakening of workers, the weakening of democracy, the failure of wages to keep up with the cost of living, the unwillingness of people in the bottom 80%, many of whom who are barely making ends meet, their unwillingness to further erode their standard of living. In a very affluent, very wealthy society, I don't think it's unreasonable for people in the bottom 50% to say, you can't ask me to further erode my standard of living so that you in the top 20, 10, 1% can get richer. We need a different social contract in the 21st century. And this is where it seems to me we need to be taking our bearings and thinking about economic policy issues in the 2020s and creating economic policy for a post-COVID, partially disintegrated economy, right? And when I say disintegrated, globalization has been somewhat reduced by COVID. What are we going to do now? We have to fight inflation, but do we have to reintegrate to the same degree into the global economy? Do we have to continue the policies of deregulation and regressive taxation, or are there things that we should be doing differently in the 2020s so that we don't continue down a path that has made so many of us economically precarious and vulnerable, increased our social anxiety, and led us to want to support political leaders who help us to convert that anxiety into anger? That's the path we're on. My suggestion is in 2022, we should be talking about how to get off that path and what kind of policies have the promise for changing the course of our economic future. That's where I will pick up with you next week. For today, I want to hear if you have questions, comments, thoughts. So who wants to start us out? You'll have to unmute yourself to talk. I did mute everybody in the beginning. Anne, go ahead. I see you with your hand up.
Yeah. I understand pretty much your description. I think was excellent of where we're at and how we got here. But what I don't really understand is that why the discontent and the difficulty that the bottom half have leads them to want autocrats who absolutely represent the top half, the very, very top. I don't understand that disconnect.
So let me start with, they gave Bill Clinton a try, right? He gave them NAFTA and more tax cuts and higher inequality in the end of Social Security as we know it. They then gave Barack Obama a try, and he did some stuff that was meaningful and helpful, like Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, but frankly, he didn't address the underlying problem, right? They're now giving Joe Biden a try, and we'll see. I think in 2021, Joe Biden did a lot of stuff that was really important, but nevertheless, he seems to have decided that it's not viable to campaign on the success of, for instance, the child tax credit in 2022 because of inflation. And so I think part of this is a comparison. The Democrats may talk about doing things for the bottom half of society, the bottom 80% of society, the middle class, but do they actually deliver? And then, right, what the populists, the autocrats, the authoritarians do is to say, let me give you a different answer, right? As opposed to all this complexity about changing tax policy and global trade and investing in human capital, let me tell you, it's all the Mexican faults, right? Let me give you a token group to blame it on. And boy, does that make things a lot simpler and a lot easier. And frankly, when you don't attach much credibility to the policy wonk elite talk of the other side, maybe I'll just give a try to the guy who gives me the simple, easy explanation. It's all China, it's all Mexico, and I can build a wall and start a tariff war, and I'll protect you from the things that are eroding your standard of living. And so, right, that's a kind of double-barreled explanation. We're actually prone to blaming those who we can scapegoat for our problems, right? That's a pretty human tendency. And if the alternative is not very credible and kind of policy wonkish and kind of sounds like the people who are already making out pretty well, trying to rationalize continuing to make out pretty well, maybe the other side is more credible. Does that help, Anne?
Yeah, it's not very satisfactory, but it does help.
Oh, you might even say it's nuts, right? But yes.
But that's what, no, but I think you're saying what they're doing. It's, you know, it only leads to way more craziness.
And understanding what they're doing is the first step, and then beginning to address it. Joan Grossman, I think I saw you with your hand up. Do you still have a question? You're muted right now. You'd have to hold down your space bar, Joan, or hit that little microphone icon. There you go.
Yeah, but it was a misunderstanding. I don't have a question ready.
Okay, sorry. I thought I saw you with your hand up. I do see, David, is that you with your hand up?
Yeah, I'm on Barbara's screen.
Yes.
If you go back to the post-World War II era and the Eisenhower years, and you look at tax rates, that was a period of time in which the top 2%, top 10%, top 20% paid a much larger portion of income tax. I can't remember the percentage, but I think it was
around 90%.
90% for the top few. And that was a period of time when the working class was far better off. And a characteristic of today's world not only started with Reagan, but it's been a policy of the Democratic administrations too, what has been to keep the tax rates real low. And I know that most Democrats don't believe in trickle down economics, but they seem to live with tax rates that privilege that point of view. And it seems to me that the other simple solution is why don't we just do everything we can to raise the tax on the top income distribution of our society. But that requires the Democrats to develop a story, a meta-narrative that's credible with the working class. And we just seem, those of us who are Democrats, seem incapable of telling that story.
And let me just offer a quick modifier here, David. The white working class. It's the white working class who primarily benefited from the middle 20th century policies. And it's the white working class who the Democrats have a real credibility problem with in the 21st century, right? And so I think it's important to see that race is integral to the mix here as well. Having said that, I think you're absolutely right to point to tax policy. Restoring the progressiveness of income taxation would be incredibly important, both to addressing inequality and also to generating the resources to allow the government to assist the people who are most vulnerable in our society. Having said that, what I will talk with you about next week is that we probably are not well served simply by being nostalgic for the tax code of the 1960s and 1970s. It was a much better tax code, but having said that, it's also the case that we're in the 21st century, we're in a global economy. And frankly, we probably didn't do enough in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And so one of the things I want to point you to next week as we continue the conversation is some of the innovative ideas for instance, keeping very wealthy people from offshoring their wealth, from parking their wealth, wherever the taxes are lowest, or sheltering it all together through hidden bank accounts, right? Another thing I want to talk with you about is taxing wealth in addition to taxing income, and then also what we do with those resources, how we can address inequality, economic vulnerability, but also I want to say lack of humanity and dignity in working conditions. And I think there are some really interesting policies, or at least proposals out there that help us to think through that. So thank you for pushing us in that direction. And I just want to offer a promissory note. We'll talk about it in detail next week. Okay, David, thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead, Flossie.
I can give you a very poignant story about what happens when you belong to Kaiser Permanente, or when you belong to Sutter, or when you use the facilities provided in the Sutter area called Pill Hill.
Yes.
I had occasion, I needed a macular degeneration shot. That is not an easy procedure. Kaiser, for some reason, could not provide me with my usual retinologist. So they sent me to Pill Hill.
Mhm.
And what a difference, both in who's serving whom and how much is it costing, how long do you have to wait, how much are you humiliated, how good is the service? To be continued. Kaiser, Pill Hill.
Yeah, and
Yes.
it's funny because a decade ago, when my son was a young man, he was playing, I should say, an adolescent. He was playing on a soccer team, the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Yeah.
And it was a very international soccer team, and some of the fathers, parents, it was the more the fathers coming out to be with the sons, were French, some were Iranian, some were Pakistani, and they were all very wealthy. I was the odd man out. And the idea that the United States had the best healthcare in the world, right? And that these people were bringing their parents over from France to get American healthcare. And I said, really? That doesn't seem to be my experience. And I study this stuff a little bit. Most people who study this think the French do much better than the Americans. And the guy smiles at me and he says, well, if you have to rely on insurance, that's probably true. Right. And so we have a highly stratified medical system, many different tiers. If you can just pay, if you don't need to use insurance, we have a gold-plated medical system for you, right? If you have to pay, I'm sorry, if you need your insurance, then yes, what kind of insurance do you have? And that's going to determine what kind of service you get. Frankly, in many circumstances, it may determine whether you live or die, right? Yeah. And so yes, no, it's one of several different layers of inequality in the United States today. Thank you for sharing that with us, Flossie. Anybody else for today? All right, everybody, please take care. Please recognize, unfortunately, that there are new strains of the virus coming around. You got to be careful. A joy, as always, to be with you guys, and I will see you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.